Good evening, everyone. So good to see you all this frigid evening. What a great sort of temperature to be focusing on a topic that reminds us of the cold and maybe the warm. I'm Louise Bradshaw. I'm the Director of Education here at the St. Louis Zoo. And it is indeed my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for another one of our fabulous conservation conversations. Just first, I also want to acknowledge the support of the Academy of Science of St. Louis. They have been a wonderful sponsor in helping to promote this lecture series, and Rose and Carolyn with Academy are outside if you want to pick up any more information from them. If you're a student here and you need to get some evidence that you were attended tonight's lecture, possibly for some extra credit, right? So even if you're an adult and you need that extra credit, they'll be outside and they can give you something for that. Now, as I introduce our speaker, I want to say that, one of the things that I've really come to appreciate from Randall Hyman's work, his amazing, amazing photographs. And some of you may have seen, and you will be seeing even more than you could possibly imagine here, some photos outside on a display. He's actually tonight offering prints for sale. So I hope you fall in love and then you open up your pocketbook and maybe it's time to get a gift for somebody, but who knows. But by way of introduction, I want to tell you our speaker tonight, Randall Hyman, is a native St. Louisan. He's a professional photojournalist and writer who's traveled the globe on magazine assignments for over 3 decades. Randall's covered natural history and cultural topics from Northern Europe to South America to Asia and to Africa. In fact, some of his photos of Africa appear in some of our exhibits up at the river's edge. His photo essays and articles have appeared in Smithsonian, National Wildlife, American History, British Heritage, Wildlife Conservation, and various National Geographic publications. So without further ado, it is indeed my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Randall Hyman.
Hi there, and thanks very much. I want to thank first the St. Louis Zoo and the Academy of Science for hosting me and for presenting this wonderful conservation conversation. I have such trouble saying that. It's a tongue twister. The series. And also thanks to all of you for coming out this evening to learn a little bit about the Norwegian Arctic and what it can teach us here in the Midwest and elsewhere in the world about climate change and dealing with it, because the Norwegian Arctic is where they are dealing with it. A good place to start the discussion about the Arctic is with the question, why does any of this matter? The Arctic, after all, is a long way off. It's half a hemisphere away, though it may not feel like that tonight. And there are no cornfields there, and certainly no polar bears here. And yet what we do in the Midwest impacts the Arctic, and we'll learn about that. And likewise, what's happening there tells us much about what's happening to the rest of the planet. So let's start with a few facts. The Arctic is warming twice as fast as the global average and is already nearly 10 degrees warmer than a century ago. The extent of Arctic sea ice, the circumpolar ice sitting on the North Pole and reaching down, has reached record lows in the past decade, dwindling to half its average coverage from the prior 20 years. So that's a really fast melting. And the amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, that's a primary greenhouse gas, and it's a driver of ocean acidification and warming temperatures, has soared in the past century to 400 parts per million. Well, what's that mean? Well, the last time we saw 400 parts per million, and we can tell this by the little bubbles trapped in glaciers eons ago. The last time we saw that level, camels were roaming the high Arctic, and seas were 30 feet higher, and yet we're at 400 parts per million now. Now, we don't have camels in the high Arctic, and the seas aren't 30 feet higher yet, but that's the last time it was at 400 parts per million. And finally, why Norway as my focus? And that answer is really threefold. First, Norway has a population that includes a substantial number of people who live in the Arctic, and they're grappling with the effects of climate change daily. Secondly, Norway is a world leader in social and environmental stewardship. In fact, my first moments in Oslo back in 1989 were spent photographing Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was then prime minister. It was a private setting. It was very interesting. And she's now the United Nations Special Envoy on climate change. And third, Norway is one of the richest nations in the world. It's rated fourth in per capita. So it's not only does it have the incentive and the track record to do something or tackle issues related to climate change, but it has the wealth. So finally is me. Why a kid from the American Midwest? Why would I be tackling this topic? Well, I am born and bred in the Midwest, here in St. Louis, and I have a love for the Ozarks and a childhood spent tramping and paddling along its streams. And it wasn't until my career began as an environmental journalist, photojournalist in the mid-1970s that I landed in Iceland. And there I acquired a love beyond my American roots, a love for the pristine world of Nordic light. For over half a year, I lived in the capital city of Reykjavik, studied Icelandic, stayed on farms, eventually found myself in the midst of a nighttime volcanic eruption, alone in a snowstorm, taking pictures for Smithsonian magazine and for a National Geographic book called Exploring Our Living Planet. The title, as it turned out, has pretty well described the trajectory of my entire career these past 30 years, shooting and writing magazine stories worldwide on natural history topics, from the plight of the Amazon rainforest and the Pantanal wetlands of Brazil to conservation issues in the national parks of South Africa, Namibia, Costa Rica, and Panama. Subsequent assignments took me across the Siberian tundra, tracking Siberian mammoth tusks, and Australian outback, along New Zealand's coasts, through Ireland, France, Scotland, Wales, and Spain, and into the Peruvian Andes and the Ecuadorian cloud forests. But my trail eventually led back to the Norwegian Arctic. In 1989, I covered a story about a Greenpeace scientist and a former Norwegian whaler sharing his whaling ship to run whale watch tours. There was a moratorium on whaling at the time, and this guy had to pay for his ship. So he got together with this Greenpeacer, a scientist, and they ran whale watch tours. They both benefited. One guy needed the platform for his science, and the other guy needed money. Well, they called it old enemies in the same boat. And that experience, along with covering bloody land conflicts in Brazil, taught me to dig deep into all sides of environmental issues, friend or foe alike, no matter my bias. And I have a bias, of course. And to my chagrin, in the case of the whale watch story, editors omitted the politically incorrect quote of the Greenpeacer admitting that he approved of a limited whale hunt. Now, these are minke whales. There are 200,000 of them in the North Atlantic. They're a smaller whale. There are lots of them. And even the Greenpeacer was cool with it, but the magazine didn't want to write that. In the Amazon story, angry letters to the Smithsonian magazine ensued when we reported that many rubber tree tappers, then championed as the key to saving the rainforest, could barely make ends meet and were fleeing the rainforest for a better life. Now, this was especially painful for me because I did admire their courage. They were fighting the ranchers, and I stayed with them in their jungle homes. And I lost a friend to ranchers' assassins. But I knew that selectively reporting only half their story, as many news outlets were doing, benefited no one. You have to tell the whole story. And so it was with equal determination to tell the whole story about climate change that I turned my attention to the Norwegian Arctic. In 2007, I reported for Wildlife Conservation magazine on the resurgence of the depleted herring industry in the Lofoten Islands and the sudden spectacular appearance of hundreds of orcas, or killer whales, in a handful of fjords. It was great for tourism, with the magical creatures swimming right offshore, but it was a fluke, excuse the pun, and bound to crash as the fish stocks became healthy enough to disperse into the open ocean. The sudden whale watch industry built upon this fleeting phenomenon was doomed to fail, as is now happening, actually. The bigger lesson, though, for me, was about imbalances in ecosystems and the ironic turns that nature takes, regardless of our human designs, when bouncing back. In July 2008, I made my way to Norway's northernmost piece of territory, the Svalbard archipelago, just 800 miles from the North Pole. The story was about the slow poisoning of the Arctic Ocean due to industrial toxins carried by wind and ocean currents on a one-way conveyor belt to high latitudes. In a quirk of fate, chemical and meteorological processes trap these toxins and lock them into the Arctic, where they forever accumulate. Among these poisons are designer toxins of the 21st century, as unregulated and as ubiquitous as PCBs and DDTs once were, and used as fire retardants in some of our favorite little devices like smartphones and laptops and computers. They're a fire retardant. They're called polybrominated diphenyls, PBDE, and you'll be hearing a lot more about them over the years to come. They are hormone disruptors. And as they travel up the food chain, like any toxin that travels up the food chain, they concentrate exponentially, along with mercury in this case, and they show up in top predators at levels that qualify the average polar bear as hazardous waste by EPA standards. Some scientists believe that occasional mixed genitalia in female polar bears may be linked to these estrogen emulators, as well as decreased health among seabird populations. Mercury from coal-fired power plants worldwide shows up in the high north, photochemically binding with brine on the ocean surface during the endless daylight of the Arctic summer. Some of it, of course, comes from the Midwest, from us, from the Ohio River Valley, from the Mississippi River Valley. And one can see that from discarded computers and electrical power generation, our reach from here in the Midwest extends farther than we could possibly imagine. My all too brief 6 days that I spent in 2008 at Svalbard's International Science Village convinced me that I had to return and spend far more time looking at the many issues affecting ecosystems and residents of the Norwegian Arctic. This past spring and summer, on a generous 4-month grant from the U.S.-Norway Fulbright Foundation, and as a guest of the Norwegian Polar Institute, the Norwegian Coast Guard, and various tourism authorities, I traveled by research ship, military frigate, ocean skiffs, cruise liner, snowmobiles across the seas and glaciers of the high Arctic, throwing in a short tour by dog sled and even a stint atop a small iceberg for good measure. It was, of course, a heck of a lot of fun, but it was sobering at the same time. It's important to note that there's no debate in Norway over whether there's climate change. Norwegians are living it. They see it every day of the year with record heat in spring and summer, and with later and shorter winters. Tens of thousands of people live in the Norwegian Arctic, and their government is acutely aware of the effects of climate change on livelihoods and population shifts. As one of the richest countries in the world with a commendable record of social and environmental stewardship, Norway is eager to show the rest of us how to deal with realities on the ground. Strict building codes, for example, ensure that new structures are extremely energy efficient, and the average Norwegian home is powered 90% by renewable energy compared to 10% on mainland Europe. In addition, taxes help discourage wasteful energy practices, with gasoline ringing up at the pump at nearly $12 a gallon. And the irony, though, out of all of this, is that much of Norway's enormous wealth is built on the North Sea oil industry, which has expanded northward into the Norwegian and Barents Seas, employing just the same ingenious technologies for petroleum extraction without oil platforms and for sequestering carbon dioxide into the deep sea oil reservoirs. The small town of Hammerfest processes vast quantities of natural gas pumped ashore through a pipeline in a borehole hidden 90 miles away, 1,000 feet below the surface of the Barents Sea, with nary a rig nor a floating platform to be seen. The facility captures all of the resident carbon dioxide in the natural gas itself, about 800,000 tons per year, and pumps it back into the subsea reservoir. Ironically, though, the huge gas-powered turbines that compress the gas into liquid and power the sprawling plant emit into the atmosphere nearly the same amount of carbon dioxide that the plant sequesters. That's about 2% of Norway's total footprint in carbon dioxide. As with any roll of cosmic dice, there are always winners and losers, and climate change is no different. After 4 months in the Norwegian Arctic, I discovered, like it or not, that humans are actually financial big winners. I discovered that as ice is receding and seabed becomes more accessible year-round, There's a boom of drilling and mining that has already transformed dying fishing villages into industrial hubs. The extraction of natural gas from the seabed has opened the door for oil drilling. Fisheries are flourishing as warmer Atlantic waters drift ever northward, bringing an upwelling of nutrients along the continental shelf and producing the largest cod fisheries ever recorded in the Barents and Norwegian seas. In the absence of treacherous sea ice, trawlers, freighters, and cruise ships are venturing farther and farther north. On the losing side, however, is the Arctic itself, the remote, fragile world of ice, permafrost and tundra that preceded man's late arrival. Ecosystems are crumbling, species are crashing, and scientists are racing to understand the complex web of interactions involved in these transitions. Besides the more obvious indicators like wildlife and glaciers, scientists are studying microscopic wildlife, the marine world, such as microalgae that capture and sequester carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, thriving in the tiny tubules in sea ice that are formed as salt extrudes to the surface during the freezing process. Multiplied by the trillions, the loss of such algae may be an unexpected but significant part of the planet's atmospheric equation. Similarly, certain fatty zooplankton that thrive only in the coldest of waters are retreating farther north, away from land, and putting seabirds such as the little auk at risk as warmer waters spread to the higher latitudes. The entire heat shield of the Arctic during summer, sea ice, is giving way to dark open ocean which absorbs rather than reflects the 24-hour sunlight and worsens an already bad situation, accelerating global warming. This process is called albedo. So for now, humans are the climate change winners in the Arctic. Shipping lanes are opening up, seabed exploitation is booming, and fisheries have never been so plentiful. But like many curves that nature does seem to throw our way, human plans mean little to ecosystems in transition. Exploitation of the high north may be all a temporary bacchanal, a last party before we are confronted by the long-term planetary consequences of a shattered Arctic. So for starters, in terms of visuals, I thought it might be interesting to, this Windows 8 is murderous to navigate. Thought we might start with this, just to give you a little idea. And then we'll follow with some videos. We're not getting audio for some reason. We're not getting any audio? Chad? Should have had audio there. Should I try it again? Of course, that's a natural process, but not at the amount it's happening now. This is flying in over Svalbard, the archipelago far north of the mainland. That's a glacier from the air at about 2,000 feet. You can see it's a river of ice. glacial ice there. That's why it's so blue, it's so dense. That too, of course, is glacial ice. Very blue due to the extreme pressure that compresses it. Spend a day with this guy. It was freezing, I mean worse than freezing, and high winds. And he got to stand down in that pit there, which was nice and warm. I had to stand up. And the only payoff was he let me fill it back in when we were done. Carbon dioxide, of course, is a greenhouse gas that's warming the planet. Svalbard reindeer, that's its specific name, species. You see, they're very different looking than most reindeer. They're very short and stout. And the little guys keep their antlers because the big guys drop them, so it's the only way they can fight for good food. And they actually can chase off a buck. The polar bears on the Svalbard archipelago are often marooned and left on land if they don't get out when they should, especially nowadays, and they starve. They hunt by sitting next to seal holes, waiting for their heads to pop up. The breathing holes. But if there's no ice, they can't hunt. So they get really emaciated. This guy looks like somebody threw a white rug over him. And they'll resort to eating eggs or chicks or whatever they can get. Of course, that's not going to sustain a polar bear. That's a black guillemot. Arctic tern, coming back from Antarctica, longest migration of all birds. Barnacle goose, come from Scotland. I spent about 2 months of my 4 months. This was really scary. Those are really steep cliffs. And if you suffer from vertigo like I do, another way to suffer from vertigo, from the bottom up. I got up top of that ladder and then I was turning around backwards to try to film downward and just about fell off. Leftovers and milk. There's the cob, the pup. This is the town of Longyearbyen, where about 1,700 people live. There's also a Russian village of 300. That's about it for the population in Svalbard. Tromsø's on the mainland, the main city of the north coast. That ship was just ghastly, by the way. It smelled horrifically bad, and it was filthy. I don't know how these guys work in those conditions. Had to wash everything, including camera straps, after a day there. does not say God is great. Thanks. That beautiful violin playing was by St. Louis and Tokyo's own Asuka Kaneko, who's right here. If she'd stand up, please, and be acknowledged. And her group, Gaia Quattro, is actually coming to St. Louis. They're from Italy and Japan. And Asuka lives in St. Louis part-time. And they'll be here March 29th at Union Avenue. So those who love to hear more of this, it will be there. I have videos also. I'm looking at the time. It's 8:10. So I can show you a few things, or we can take some questions. If you want to get a better feel for the Arctic, let me just show you one thing. Let me get my glasses on. I can't see anything without them. I'm telling you, this Windows 8 is just miserable. I cannot navigate anything in it. There we go. You know those reindeer? Well, this is just 30 seconds to give you a feel of how cold and windy it is there. These guys are eking out a living. God only knows what they're finding to eat underneath that snow and ice. But some of them make it through the winter, not all of them. Another kind of interesting thing. Let's see. Well, it's not all grim. This is kind of fun. I'm climbing on an iceberg. I was with the Coast Guard and we were just fooling around. There they go. Hey, fellas! Fellas! I was just kidding! Come on, guys, come back! It's a singular feeling to look on all 360 and just see ocean forever, and you're on an iceberg, a little piece of ice in the middle of it. They came back.
I'm good. That's got to be the best thing I did the whole trip.
It was fun. Let's see. Oh, goodness. You know, the reindeer, there a lot of scientific research. This is pretty cool. I'll just show you this for fun. And the trawler stuff is interesting, too, but you saw enough of that smelly, stinky trawler. God, I saw enough of it. That was my one selfie of the whole trip. I held it out like that. So we're right off the west coast of the Svalbard archipelago toward Greenland. And we're taking these samples, but there's no ice. There should be at this time of year. I'm up in the crow's nest. If you look closely, you'll see what I had to climb to get up there, this rope ladder. These big nets, there are two kinds of nets. That white one on the deck, and then this green one just takes the whole column. The white one has 5 nets in it that are triggered at different depths. And on the right, this white thing that is dropped a bunch of instruments about a mile down to measure the density, the temperature, conductivity, and also takes water samples of zooplankton and phytoplankton. That's wind you're hearing, by the way. That's incessant in the Arctic. You can't get around it. Most of the time. So this was an issue of concern to everyone. There's just no ice to be found as we went farther and farther north. Degrees. It's because it's salt, so it's below 32 when it freezes. This is the last land we'll see for days, looking southward, the tip of the Svalbard archipelago. So from here on out, we're looking for ice, lots of it. And the key to the ice is it multi-year or is it just freeze that year? Multi-year is real thick, and it's what you used to get in the Arctic. But now the ice cover is very thin. Even if their extent may increase a little, it's still too thin, not sustainable. Getting thicker. There's the polar bear tracks to the right there.
You see, this is polar bear tracks.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah.
Easily entertaining.
You saw them?
Yep. Whoa! We're cracking it apart with our bow. You can see the zigzag that we have to go because we keep hitting ice on that chart there. Now we're at about 82 degrees north, about 500 miles from the North Pole. And we're looking for this brown color you get from the ice algae that I referred to earlier. Because that's what they want to really test. They want to do tests of the oxygen and carbon dioxide balance. Now we're stuck for a bit. So it's a good time to go diving under the ice as far as they're concerned. We're in the bridge. Here we go. You see the guy in the background, he's cutting a hole in the melt pond where he found a seal hole. About 2 meters.
Look.
Oh, this one was about a meter. It was thinner here.
Look, they're nice.
2.5 miles. I was sitting there next to that hole filming. If I slip in, it's 2.5 miles down. Not that I would have fallen. I would have floated. And the way I got this following footage was I took a painter's pole, an extendable pole, and I mounted a GoPro, head cam on top of it, and plunged my arm through it with the pole extended, 6-8 feet, and followed the cords to figure out where they would be diving, because they have to have these cords. So I really lucked out. I pointed the camera in the right direction. That's the breathing hole that they dived down through. See how blurry it is where the salt and freshwater mix? So we didn't find much plankton there, phytoplankton or zooplankton, so we moved on farther north. Normally the 24-hour sunlight causes a bloom of this. And it had, but it was earlier than it normally would be, again, because the seasons are changing. So we were too late for the algae in that area. And they want to measure the energetics of the carbon dioxide uptake and the oxygen output.
He inserted a line that people like me who were doing sea life ecology research at the time might be out of a job if this continues for the next 10, 15 years. And here I am. Looks like the stuff we're supposed to work with, the stuff that we're supposed to sample, isn't to be found. Maybe he was right. He just meant it as a joke.
That was poignant to me, that couldn't find what he had already studied in years prior. And here is about 2 meters thick, by the way. Polar bears are sea creatures more than land creatures, so they can pop up anywhere. They swim tremendous distances if they stick with the ice. You can see some of the zooplankton and jellies, jellyfish family. All these little white things. Those are Calanus, copepods. You see them swimming everywhere. It was teeming with life. And the waters are 29 Fahrenheit. But this is the base of the food chain. And they're diving like 100 feet down. Of course, I didn't get that on my camera. There's our research ship. This is an instrument for gathering zooplankton and phytoplankton with that net, and then it channels it into that container. Look at that gorgeous ice and that blue. And there's a Calanus just swimming by. So he's got a full canister there to hand to the others. Now he's got a GoPro on his head. type of fish? Arctic cod, yes, but they're not the same as a commercial cod. They're little guys. Thanks. I guess it's question time. So without further ado, I'll open it up to any curious questions you might have. Just raise your hand and I'll do my best to see out there. Yeah.
Randy, how much permitting and bureaucracy did it take to get the ability to do this?
I was a guest of the Norwegian Polar Institute, so I had all the permits I needed. But you're right, the Svalbard Archipelago, the entire thing's a national park, and it's very regulated, and so you can't just go up there in a, well, if you could go up there in a boat of your own and just do anything you want, you have to have permits to get on the land and walk around. And you got to have a gun. You always are required to have a rifle that can take down a polar bear, because they are everywhere, 3,000 of them in the Svalbard archipelago. Yeah?
Are there many claims from other countries like Russia and other countries trying to claim some of the property now that they can get in there?
Fantastic question, yeah. The Svalbard Treaty was signed in 1920, and it has I think, 40 signatories now. And the Russians are the big ones, and they said, okay, we'll let you Norwegians claim this is your territory, but we'll only sign it if we have extraction, mining rights and whatnot. So the reason the Russians won't sign the papers that the Norwegian Coast Guard presents after an inspection is that they claim that included the territorial waters around the Svalbard archipelago, and the Norwegians say, land only. You have your coal mine. It's this pathetic coal mine where dozens of Russian miners have died in fires and whatnot. And they maintain this pathetic coal mine in a village of less than 300 for the purposes of staking claim to the Arctic in that region. Yeah.
What I took mostly from this, and not knowing much, is that the Russians aren't to be trusted. They are people that support regimes like Syria. When it comes to your photography, which is wonderful, and it's a photo essayist, I guess, or a photojournalist, that you're making your living. The pictures were marvelous. I have no question at all. But the one warning I took, there's a tipping point, is when you can't shoot a polar bear. There are no polar bears. There still are polar bears. You've done this for at most 5 or 6 years, I think.
Well, I was just 4 months this summer and spring. Yeah.
I mean, they say that the study goes back to 1979. I don't think that's nearly enough to prove this necessarily.
Prove what?
Prove that global warming is happening as precipitously as is planned. I think there isn't enough information, there isn't enough surety to take people that don't know enough about it and make them vote with their money, not just with there's global warming. I don't think I don't think scientists have succeeded in proving that beyond reasonable doubt there is global warming, and if there is, it's going to be that precipitous, and we're going to throw money out.
Well, that's the beauty of an open forum. We hear all opinions. Any other questions? Yeah.
If this gentleman would have been here a couple months ago, he would have heard a lecture from Polar Bear International, and the guy that studies and puts bands around polar bears, and he would have told the gentleman that polar bears cannot swim indefinitely, and and the cubs drown, and the facts and the statistics are against the polar bears. Polar Bear International started. You might want to check that out.
Is he still carrying a polar bear rifle?
I don't know.
Any other questions? Yeah.
When your divers were in the water, because of the temperature of the water, what was the limitation of their dives?
About an hour. And they can go as, deep as 100. One of them was using a rebreather because one of the problems is you saw those bubbles come up and they hit the surface, and here they are trying to take samples and such. So you see more and more of people using rebreathers, as they're called, to try to limit the amount of bubbles. Yeah, way back there.
How did you first get interested in this and involved in it?
Well, I've been doing this, the environmental beat, so to speak. Well, I started in Iceland in the subarctic 30 years ago and wandered all over the globe, but there was a real attraction for me to return there because it's a beautiful part of the world and less pristine than it was 30 years ago.
How does you say here we effect on the Arctic? I just want to know how.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. You wanted to know how what?
So you said how do we affect the Arctic here in Missouri? How do we do that?
For example, coal-burning power plants emit a lot of mercury, and mercury is an important toxin, and it's carried by coincidence of ocean and wind currents to the Arctic. It's an unfortunate coincidence, and another coincidence that there are meteorological and physical mechanisms that capture that and trap it, and it stays there forever, and then it goes up and up and up the food chain. So you've got our smartphones, our laptops, all these things that have toxins in them, fire retardants, mercury. If you have it in a landfill, it goes into the Merrimack, down the Mississippi, into the Gulf, and then up the Gulf Stream and clear up to the Arctic. And it gets trapped. It's unfortunate, but that's how it works. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of working with photographic equipment in this sort of extreme environment?
Yeah. Your batteries run out really fast, so you carry a lot of them. It's not as bad as it used to be. I've been shooting over 30 years, and the old cameras, you had lubrication issues with the moving parts, but in digital cameras, it's not as big an issue because there's less moving parts. Yeah. What did I shoot with? I use a Canon system. I use 3 bodies and about 5 different lenses. For photographers out there, the longer stuff was a 300 f2.8, and then down the line. Yes?
You talked about how they're sequestering carbon dioxide in the seabed. Do you know if there's been any studies done that, whether there's any downsides to it?
Yeah, I talked to one of the scientists in Longyearbyen about that, and it's a tricky thing to do. First of all, unfortunately, Norway, with the change of government in September, a more conservative government, has abandoned the big sequestration project in the south. But they were the first people to do it, and they did it for economic reasons. They were in the North Sea, they had all this oil they were pumping up, and they had the carbon dioxide, and it made sense to pump it down and push more oil out. So they started sequestering the carbon dioxide in the extraction zone. And so it was really for economic reasons originally. And they're way ahead of everybody on this. And I'm trying to remember the very beginning you asked me. Yeah, if you have to be really careful in the strata because in Longyearbyen they wanted to do a sequestration of the carbon dioxide from their coal burning plant, their power plant in the village. And what they discovered was the strata is at an angle and 15 kilometers outside town, it comes to the surface. So it's not an aquifer, but it's a reservoir system, a geological reservoir system, and so you got to really know what you're doing when you do this because it comes back up if you don't plan it right. Yeah, any more? Yes. I just got invited by the Norwegian embassy to go back in a month to the week-long international conference on the Arctic, so I'll be going back next month. Well, as I said, first of all, there's no doubt that there's climate change. They live with it daily. They've seen in over 30 years, I've seen over 30 years, all sorts of dramatic changes. So they're not arguing about it anymore, but they're benefiting from it. I mean, like it or not, as an environmental journalist, I had to admit that so far, so good for them, not so good for the environment, and I think it's pretty clear that there's a kickback eventually, because we're living all in the same soup. And if everything's out of balance, then we're going to suffer from it, eventually. And we're seeing you can never put your finger on what's a freak storm and what's, tied to what, but there's definitely a trend over my 30 years in the Arctic. Going back to the Arctic, I spent a lot of time in the tropical regions in the Amazon as well, so, yeah.
This is a really not political question.
Good.
They seemed really not disturbed by your presence. What was the closest that you got to some of those animals that you have?
Well, they let me get really close, but the wind was ferocious. It was tearing up everything, and the scientists I was with said, my only regret was that I didn't have a camera to photograph you being blown asunder with your equipment and everything and your coat. And, so there's no record of that. But they didn't care. They were trying to eat. And those two little calves just started walking right at me. And they keep those tiny little spindly antlers because the bucks lose them, just like our male deer lose their antlers. But the females keep theirs, and the little guys keep theirs, and it allows them a certain advantage in feeding that they can actually, and the scientist said he's seen them chase away a big buck because they lose their antlers. These guys have these pokers, and they can stick it in the side. So, they need that advantage because they're little and they're struggling to survive. Yes? Yeah, I see it. Go ahead. Yes, dinosaurs. The Svalbard archipelago was tropical long ago. So there are some dinosaur fossils, and there's some fascinating research that I'm probably going to go up and record later this year using the seashells, clams, and the rings that they're growth rings in the same way you can use tree rings to look at climate. So that's another interesting thing. Not fossil exactly, but sort of. Yes?
So when you're jumping over an iceberg, what is your ability, how do you know it's not going to capsize?
It's a real dumb thing to do. But it was fun. They flip. I've seen them flip. They're just sitting there and they're melting underneath, and all of a sudden they're off balance and they whoosh. Yeah. It's not a real good idea. Don't do it. Don't do this at home. Louise, am I running okay, or should I take a... Oh, okay, yeah. The males become bachelors and stay away, but the calves stay with the moms. And that's very typical in herbivores. Yeah, anybody else? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, there's somebody back here. I can't see.
Is it legal for reindeer or polar bears?
Let me see. Polar bear, no. Reindeer, yes. But in Svalbard, the population was so low years ago that they limited the hunt for a long time. And I'm trying to remember if in Svalbard if it's still restricted, but certainly no polar bear. If you are out of the number 10 zone, which is Longyearbyen, if you're out of the zone where you're allowed to go without permit from the town of Longyearbyen, once you get outside of there, you first of all, if you step outside of Longyearbyen, you have to have a gun. If they find you without a rifle, which I did because I got really fed up of being stuck in the village, and I started hiking outside, and I thought, I can't wait, I got to get out. But it's illegal. You have to have a gun with you. But if you get farther and something happens and you've got your gun, if you do end up having to shoot a polar bear, there's a huge investigation launched into where was it when you shot it, did you fire warning shots, It's very restricted. Yes, back there.
You shot a polar bear if you saw it on site, and that guy was walking around the hole with the rifle?
I can't quite hear your question.
Would you have shot a polar bear on site when the guy was patrolling the hole?
Oh, would he have shot a polar bear? No, absolutely not. He would shot, no. They have flares and warning pistols. You don't shoot, it's a huge fine if it's found that you could have done anything else besides kill it. So you do everything else you can do besides shoot it. Yeah, somebody's pointing over there. Okay.
I'm curious to hear about with this booming cod industry.
Yes.
How, and having found that there's bioaccumulative toxins, what's the quality of the fish? I'm just curious if they've been affected as well.
I don't know the answer to that, but I would assume that, that's an issue. I think you get those little cards at even a supermarket that tell you which fish are safe and which aren't. And as far as cod, they are a predator fish, so they eat other fish. So yeah, they're upper tier. They're not the top, but yeah, I would think toxins would be, but I don't know the answer, honestly. Yes? Well, believe it or not, polar bear kill very few reindeer. The natural predator of reindeer is starvation. And as you can see, in that environment, easily starve. And if you get an icy winter like they're getting more and more of because they're having these weird rains in the middle of the winter that they never saw before, and then it freezes and you get layers and layers of ice, they can't paw their way through to the tundra. So they starve. Well, there are no wolves, but the foxes, their population soars after a good starving winter because they're eating all the carcasses, the Arctic fox. Any other? How am I, Louise? Oh, one more.
Given that 97% of the scientists out there agree with you, saying that global warming is real and it's man-made, the National Academy of Sciences all over the world, 100% of them agree with you. Even the oil companies agree with you. What would you have us do to change what's going on?
Well, I don't understand why people are so opposed to whether there's climate change or not. Because if we make a mistake, hypothetically, and it's pretty clear to everybody in the sciences that 90% of them, 95%, that there is no mistaking about this. But what would be the terrible thing about making our planet cleaner? If you got guests coming over and you clean your bathroom and then they don't show, do you feel really bad that you cleaned the toilet? I mean, you're better off, right? Okay. I guess if everybody's content, I'll bring it to an end. Is that all right, Louise? All right. Thank you.